This is the final session, and as you can see, the issue, the subject at hand is what is the definition of victory, which is another way of saying, how do we define war aims? How do we define our requirements to settle? And I would actually say, even though it's the final session, in some ways, it's been a part of every session. When you think about the conversations of yesterday and today, one way or another, this issue has been part of the of every panel here. And suddenly, this question of victory has become anything but academic. Think about the last 72 hours. And suddenly, what we're reading on social media, what the president was talking about, what we're seeing and learning about the situation on the ground is there's a dynamic to all conflicts, and it's quite possible that the dynamic of this one is changing and changing for the better, and I don't know if it's the beginning of the end or the end of the beginning, but it's something. So again, this subject to me has suddenly taken on a new importance. So I've been sitting here for the last 2 days taking notes very carefully. And in the way of introduction, let me just say I've come up with 7 possible ways of defining victory. I'm sure there's more, but let me give you 7. And I think they are distinctions with a difference. And we had a meeting on just this subject. Victor knows about it. He saw it at the Council on Foreign Relations about 3 months ago. It was at the 100-day point, not the 200-day point. And it's interesting how the conversation has moved. But let me just give you 7 very quickly. I won't filibuster. I no longer live in Washington. 7 definitions, very quick definitions of victory. The first and most, and they'll go from modest to ambitious. The most modest is to preserve a viable, independent Ukraine. Doesn't get into any territorial detail. Secondly, would be to return to the lines that existed before 2014. Third definition would be full territorial integrity, but not including Crimea. Fourth definition would be full territorial integrity for Ukraine, including Crimea, Donbass, and everything else. Fifth would be full territorial integrity plus reparations. Sixth would be full territorial integrity and accountability for war crimes. And seventh would be full territorial integrity, possibly reparations, war crimes accountability, and formal acceptance by Russia of Ukraine's borders and a renunciation of all claims by Russia against Ukraine. So I can imagine a series of definitions of what would constitute victory. And what I'd like to do with first with the 2 gentlemen flanking me, the Minister of Defense, Oleksii Reznikov, as well as with Radoslav Sikorski, a member of the European Parliament, former Marshal and Minister of Foreign Affairs in the neighboring country here, in Poland, is ask them about what is the definition of victory, and then I may have some follow-up questions. And then we've got an enormous amount of experience and talent in this room, and I'd like to get their perspectives on what they think and what they've heard. So, Mr. Minister, I know you're just back from Ramstein. Good to see you here. Thank you for making this additional effort. Thank you for all you've done more broadly. So how should we think about victory?
Thank you. I would like to speak Ukrainian because I see a lot of Ukrainian eyes, and I think that it will be fixed in the history and people will see it on TV screen. So please use your systems. I like this word systems because I like 155 artillery systems, HIMARS systems. So I know a lot of systems. I'm a civilian, you know, I'm a lawyer in my background, but I know a lot of new kind of systems. Доброго дня.
Good evening. For me, understanding of victory is perfectly clear-cut. As a former member of the Ukrainian delegation to Minsk and Normandy, for that matter, I would like to thank President Zelensky, who decided to close that delegation because it had no chances. I mean, Minsk delegation. For the people facing us across the table, we had some ideas about coming to terms with them. As of the 24th of February this year, well, this kind of victory cannot be accepted by Ukrainians. We have to fully restore our territorial sovereignty within the internationally recognized borders as of 1991. And this means the Crimea is Ukraine, Donbas, all Ukrainian Donbas should be Ukrainian. About the reparations, you're absolutely right. The Russians have to pay, and their descendants have to pay for all the ruin, all the damage, Bucha, Hostomel, Irpin, Rodyanka, Volnovakha, Kharkiv, and Mariupol, and many other places. Thirdly, they are committing crimes in the territory of Ukraine. And that means future big tribunal, Nuremberg 2, perhaps we can call it, but it should take place in either Mariupol or Kharkiv. But essentially, it's going to be another Nuremberg trial for the war criminals, for issuing criminal orders. They have to be made liable internationally. And as a sign, for me as a person, the sign of victory for me is when I can board a plane in Kharkiv and fly to Mariupol, to the local airport, making a domestic flight, and then go to Kherson, and then from Kherson go to Istanbul or London or Washington for that matter. And that will mean that Ukraine is safe, Ukraine is secure, Ukrainian citizens are coming back from all the jurisdictions. If they leave Ukraine, it's just for business trip, or for business or pleasure, not for the war.
What I'd like to do what I'd like to do is ask you then a few follow-up questions. What you just in terms of what you just said first. You didn't mention, and I just want to make sure I understand you, that this somehow be codified in a formal agreement. You're a lawyer. Is it important to you? Imagine you could get everything you just said: full territorial restoration of Ukraine, reparations, war crimes accountability through an international tribunal of some sort, but you didn't have a formal treaty of any sort. Would that be a problem?
Ну, по-перше, це не проблема.
This is not a problem. This is for lawyers to decide, and perhaps I'll be lucky enough to be on the team, but it will look very simple. The analogy of 1945, the defeat of the Nazi Germany and Capitulation Act done by representatives of Berlin for alliance of the victors. And the Capitulation Act will somehow formalize, will find a way, I promise.
A second follow-up question. Can you imagine a scenario under which Ukraine would not compromise on anything you've said, but could accept this being done in pieces? I.e., could there be a scenario where there could be so-called interim arrangements, that there could be goals, but could there, and just to be clear, by the way, my role here is not to be an advocate. I'm trying to get a better understanding. So when I ask questions, don't think I have a secret agenda. I am simply trying to get some clarity and understanding on the table here. Could you imagine a situation where this could be either, well, put it this way, it could be implemented in phases?
Мені здається, що
I think that we have learned many things. Among all of them, we learned not to trust all the attempts to help us with our peace agreement in Ukraine. Unfortunately, starting from 2014, we've had many such attempts coming even from our partners, but the tools or the arrangements that were offered were not viable. For example, Budapest memorandum, which was signed, we received our guarantees, safeguards, and we abandoned the nuclear capabilities, the third potential in the world, and it didn't work for us. So we do not trust in any kind of talks or formal protocols that everything is going to be just fine tomorrow. Only if we arrange and design for a new architecture of security in the world with clear and comprehensive guarantees provided by the partners we trust and will trust, most importantly, only then such a document is possible, and it is going to be multilateral. It is not going to be some kind of understanding between Russia and Ukraine. This will be multilateral, and the key piece is architecture of security for Ukraine, in which we'll be able to believe.
I understand you, that suggests that when you talk about a multilateral architecture, a security architecture, that will involve some degree of security assurances, guarantees, commitments from your security partners. Okay, so you've just articulated what I would call a fairly ambitious agenda, and it came up a little bit in the last session. Can you imagine on God's green earth that Vladimir Putin could ever sign off on that?
Quite frankly, I cannot forecast his future destiny. Perhaps it won't be him. Maybe his successor who will try to pull Russia out of the abyss they are now entering with the speed of a downed aircraft. We cannot imagine how dramatically and drastically their life will change in Russia. The people who will have some coup d'etat or whatever will happen, but it will happen soon. I'm sure they will look for some way out, and they will beg our allies to sign this capitulation act, and that will be same in their face. And what the person you mentioned will do in his future. I talk to the military, so I might use my French in this situation.
Last question. Could you imagine that Ukraine is part of this, and maybe it's beyond your job? In a sense, this might be a decision more for the president or even for others as well, that there could be any compromise on any of this. For example, if Russia were, you said you don't trust them, but if they were to sign an agreement talking about an independent Ukraine, or that there could be certain commitments about, say, autonomy, a degree of autonomy in certain areas of Ukraine, that there could be some areas of flexibility on your part. Again, you're a lawyer, and one often goes to lawyers to create understandings. Could there be some gray in this, or is it only black and white?
It seems to me that you should not invent anything. It's all in the Ukrainian constitution. The autonomy of the Crimea is in the constitution. So it's just very simple. We have to deoccupy the territory and abide by the constitution. The Ukrainian parliament, the Crimean Ukrainian parliament, the Crimean Ukrainian cabinet, the local councils, but the issue of Sebastopol, the Russian Black Sea fleet is not an issue. It's history, because the Ukrainian society, the Ukrainian people cannot see any compromises with Russia. They kill, they're still killing, raping, they are looting, they are robbing. There's no compromise in there. The Ukrainian parliament is a reflection of the Ukrainian society with different political inclinations, but the only thing is that Russia should be defeated, definitely, and we will dictate the conditions. If the parliament reflects the people's opinions and ideas. President is also elected, and we are on the same side. Moreover, I'm just back from Ramstein, another Ramstein. I was looking to the eyes of ministers of defense, 50 delegations, 26 ministers, personally, 18 chods, heads of general staffs, and they all were telling me the same thing. We want your victory. We want to share this victory, and your victory will be our joint one. So we are not alone in that.
Good. Last question before I turn.
Last not least.
Before I turn to Radek. If we had had this conversation, say, on March 1st, a week after this phase of the conflict began, would you have given the same answer, or have the last 6-7 months hardened the Ukrainian position because of what happened at Bucha, because of what we've seen in Mariupol? Has the consensus in this country, in your government, evolved because of the course of this war?
I think that we had that consensus even before the invasion, and we had meetings of all the leaders of the parliamentary political forces. On the eve of that invasion, we had a big meeting with the big business, medium-sized business. We were all on the same page because we wanted to fight for the country for survival back then. I once shared this story. I received that call on the next day after the invasion from the Minister of Defense of Belarus. Wall States. He was on the ropes, but he was instructed to inform me on Minister Shoigu's position that they suggested quick capitulation for Ukraine, and then the special operation would be over. My reaction was very simple. I said that we can accept capitulation from Russia anytime, and that was our consensus even back then. That was the second day after invasion. That tells the story.
The second most memorable line of the conflict. Radek, it's not that I'm not interested in your own position, but I'm actually asking you more about your reading of the European point of view, which is if all of the ministers, not just defense counterparts, but ministers of foreign affairs heard that, prime ministers, presidents, what have you, heard that, what do you think the general reaction would be in Europe? First of all, would there be a general reaction? Or do you think we'd be more likely to hear what I would describe as a differentiated reaction?
First of all, let me mention, because perhaps not everybody in the room knows, that the Ukrainian and Polish national anthems start the same way. And ours contains the words, "What's been taken by foreign hand will be taken back by the sword." And I hope that happens. And it's actually conceptually the easiest solution, because you just take back your own property. So we are discussing the possibility that it won't be that simple, right? And when I read the title of the panel, Definitions of Victory, I thought we meant definitions of victory for both sides. And
we can go there.
Look, I think it's important. I think Putin's definition of victory was contained not only in his essay of July last year, but primarily in the prematurely released statement by RIA Novosti when they thought they were about to take Kyiv. And their definition of history was, and I use it advisedly, the final solution of the Ukrainian problem. Ukraine was going to be wiped out as a separate entity, as a nation with large-scale eradication of elites. Okay? Putin has now already moved. He now talks about capitulation and Russian language issues and so on. So we need to move him further. And I don't think the Second World War is helpful here, because much as I admire and cheer on the Ukrainian army, I don't think you're going to take Moscow. Therefore, we need to go to Therefore, we need to go to earlier conflicts. And I think both the Crimean War, nomen omen, and the Russo-Japanese War are useful. The way they ended was with Russia suing for peace at the end of the Crimean War, the Tsar actually dying, which is also an interesting circumstance, and then a period of reform in Russia. Russo-Japanese War ended with when the Russian population started rioting, and Nicholas II conceded, and again, a period of reform ensued in Russia. I have my 8th definition of victory for you, namely change of regime in Russia, which might actually be a precondition to any of the other definitions of victory, because we can't trust anything that Putin says or signs, and why would we expect the Ukrainians to do so?
I actually had that as one, but I took it out because I thought rather than as an end, that might be a necessary means to an end, as opposed to simply stating it as an objective. But you could be right. It could, that Putin himself may never agree to the sort of terms the minister articulated. It might take some post-Putin leadership that wants to reintegrate Russia with Europe and with the world to agree to it.
Ukraine will be safe when when a Russian de Gaulle says that the imperial project was a mistake, and the next day Belarus falls, and we have a Russia rejoining the pro-Western trajectory. Because I don't think Putin is capable of that, nor would we trust him to do that.
So just to press you on that, another analogy might be Khrushchev after Stalin, someone who would come along and criticize the excesses of the previous leader. Do you think there are things that could and should be said that might encourage that? So rather than making it a precondition of the end of the war, could still hopefully accelerate or increase the odds that that kind of change might be forthcoming? Basically, for example, giving Russians incentives to move against Mr. Putin.
We should be talking to the Russian opposition, but the main thing is for the Ukrainian army to impose greater costs on the Russian army. The Tsars would not have moved if the Russian army had been victorious, either against the British and the French or against the Japanese. So this is our side of the negotiation.
Before I turn to our esteemed excellencies here, any reaction to that?
Я би хотів додати абсолютно.
I would like to add, and you were just hitting the bullseye. I agree with all that. But when we talk to our military, our generals, and we discuss like the two campaigns in Kharkiv and Kherson regions, well, sometimes we wish that the Russians just flee, fall back, and we just take those territories. And our militaries say that it is very important, before they fall back, we have to destroy as many of them as possible, the equipment and the military personnel, because if we let them run, they will come back in a couple of weeks or a couple of months, and they will try to re-enter Ukraine. We have to undermine the strength of the Russian army. With this destruction, the opposition in Russia will be in position to criticize. Before that, the world didn't believe that Russians could be defeated. Everyone thought that that was the second best army in the world. They were undefeatable, and that Ukraine would fall within 72 hours. That was right. The Russians thought that way, and our friends in many countries. So nobody was providing us with serious weaponry, because it made no sense with that defeats within 72 hours. Now we have proof that Russians can be beaten, and they will be beaten, and we'll do that. That's for us to do.
I want to bring in some talent from the floor here and some of their perspectives. I want to begin with Wolfgang Ischinger, who for years headed up the Munich Security Forum and now is the chairman of the board, or whatever title, Erbotschafter now has. Wolfgang, what is your sense of where the center of Europe is on this question, on what ought to constitute victory?
Well, thank you very much. This is, of course, an immensely important discussion. Quite frankly, I don't know what most European leaders would be willing to say on this question here. So what I'm saying is literally just my own guess. But the point I want to make is that in my understanding, if we talk about victory, not only in the sense of, the military conclusion of warfighting, we need to think about two concepts. The one is how to end the war successfully. That's what you guys have been talking about so far. And then comes the second phase, which is probably the far more complex one. That is the question of the establishment of peace. Because I think at the end of the day, in the longer term, you don't just want the absence of war. You want the return of a peace order for Ukraine, for the environment. And if you give me 1.5 more minutes, let me just, make 2 points on this. In 1945, my country ended the war by unconditional surrender. And we were correctly accused of genocide and war crimes without end. And within just a couple of years after that end, after the unconditional surrender of Germany, came the first gestures from what are now our Western allies, the United States and others, to invite us back into the community. In other words, the German example that I'm referring to is, it demonstrates that even if one hates each other terribly, and even if after terrible crimes have been committed in the names of one country, there must be, and I say this as a formally practicing diplomat, there must be also a vision of how to bring about peace. So I think we should also be devoting a little bit of time to the question of, let's assume there is a conclusion of the war. How can you move from that to something which for Germany for the last 7 years was very important, reconciliation? It's not a word that you might find useful at this moment while the war lasts, but it will come up at some point.
I would just say that it's hard to imagine Mr. Putin wanting integration in the West, because he would see that as a threat to his rule. Again, it might conceivably appeal to an alternative Russian leadership. I see lots of, I wanted to get Steve Sestanovich for a second.
And the Germans did have a change of leader.
They did. Let me just get Steve, who's one of America's leading former Soviet, now Russian experts. What is your sense of what could push Mr. Putin to move in the direction of what we're hearing here, Steve? If anything, is there a way to get him, how would I put it, to define success down?
Probably not. Putin is a very stubborn guy whose mindset, this was the topic of a discussion last night that I didn't hear, is extremely rigid. It's based on now increasingly on a sort of ethno-nationalist hysteria. And for him, the question is not going to be how to reconcile, but how to survive domestically if he's defeated. Because this will be the most serious political challenge that he's faced in 20 years. And the upheaval inside Russia is potentially greater than anything that he has had to face. Much worse than the demonstrations about pensions and so forth. This is a fundamental challenge to his regime, and I think people who say that he is he can count on the police and the military, underestimate the divisions within that state. But Richard, I wanted to put a question to you about you heard Mrs. Zelensky put the questions back to Tim Snyder. I'm going to put the question back to you. In your definition of victory, between number 1 and number 2, you jumped to the restoration of the 2014 borders. But one outcome that people have often talked about is just the restoration of the February 24th lines. And I wonder whether Minister Reznikov or former Minister Sikorsky could talk about that, because once you get close to that, you have already got a gigantic defeat for Putin. But you may have the opportunity to end the destruction and the chaos earlier without giving up any future claims. What's your view? Because many people have talked about this as another outcome that wouldn't foreclose any Ukrainian claims in the future, but that would end the war earlier.
Well, again, I thought I mentioned that. If I didn't, my bad. I took it from what I heard from the minister. You can speak for yourself. You don't need me to speak for you. That would, if it ever was acceptable, it's not acceptable now. Is that fair?
Так, я можу вам розкрити один інсайт.
I can reveal one secret for you. I can do it now. 3 times I visited Belarus when after the invasion, and once Turkey. After the invasion for some parleys, and we were facing the Russian delegation, and we were clear-cut in our message. That was the first week. So if we want to continue these talks and come to some conclusion, you have to withdraw your forces and come back to the lines of the 23rd of February 2022. That was still possible at that point. We would accept that without any destruction and casualties, so many casualties. But now they have passed the point of no return. So there is no option of the lines of the 23rd of February 2022. Humanity is past that line. 1991. And that's it.
Ambassador Taylor here. Bill Taylor? Yes, no?
Minister.
Bill, I'd be curious, given your background, you giving your perspective on the administration's reactions. We heard from both Tory Newland and Jake Sullivan, who basically both said, we don't have a position on this. Whatever Ukraine wants, we'll support. It's not for us to decide. Do you think that's really the U.S. position? Should it be the U.S. position? What is your take on the American view of the definition of victory?
Well, you heard from the Americans. You heard from senior officials there, Richard. So, yes, I think that's exactly what the administration believes, that Minister Reznikov and his government are in the best position to define victory, and that we should support that. So I'm with them.
I'm not asking if you're with them. I'm asking you, that's a different issue. Always respect your opinion. Do you think, though, that within the U.S. government, that essentially means that the United States has decided that however ambitious Ukraine wants to make its definition of victory, we sign on to it, even though that would have implications for us? It would have implications for the level of support we would need to give. It would have implications for potential challenges by Russia to U.S. interests in the theater. It would have consequences potentially for U.S. ability to act on behalf of U.S. interests worldwide, vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis Iran. We could go down the list. So do you actually believe that is the U.S. position? I understand why it's politically useful for the administration to say that, but you actually think, down when push comes to shove, that will be the U.S. position?
I do, Richard, I do. I think that's exactly right. There's a negotiation, there's a conversation. We've heard over and over the conversation between Minister Reznikov and Secretary Austin. as well as General Milley and General Zaluzhny, as well as Jake Sullivan and Andriy Yermak. They have a regular conversation. So we understand what they are after. We understand that they need to win for all the reasons that we've talked about over the past 2 days. And we're going to do, I think the U.S. government is ready to do what it takes to allow them to win.
I would add it Kuleba and Blinken also as well.
And exactly, they also have that conversation as well. Thank you, Minister.
Quickly, Radek, and then I want to go to...
I think it's relatively simple. If you lose a war, you generally lose territory. But I don't think it's helpful for us to be making suggestions to people who are fighting for their lives, because they have politics too, and they need to motivate their nation for the struggle.
We have a member of parliament. Thank you for being here, particularly given what's going on in your own country. I know it was not an easy decision to be here and stay here, so thank you. And would love to get your perspective, a British perspective.
Thank you very much indeed. Hello, everyone. I'm a member of Parliament from the United Kingdom. My name is Bob Seeley. I'm here with 7 members of Parliament who are at the back row there from 4 different political parties. And I think it is safe to say that Ukraine is the single political issue that unites everyone in our Parliament. When it comes to what the definition of victory is, look, one of the wonderful things about Ben Wallace, and we were talking about that with the Defence Secretary just a few minutes ago, was that Ben and indeed the British government have just said what you need. We have just tried to be right. We're friends. You know, we're close to you, what you need, and we will move heaven and earth to get it. I know you're not getting enough MLRS. I know you're not getting enough of other stuff. I'm sorry that Boris is gone. When I was in Odessa in April, I was buying pictures of Boris the Cossack, getting Ukrainian troops to sign it, sending it to Boris to cheer him up. It went into the Lewin Downing Street. I don't know where it is now. I have to say, catastrophic Russian collapse frightens me. The narrative of existential threat if Ukraine survives to justify potential nuclear use concerns me. So yeah, all these things concern us, but right now what we're doing is what the Americans did for us in World War II. Give you the tools, you finish the job. And that is the most important thing. Just finally, when we were on the border on Thursday night, our lovely Queen was dying, God bless her, and we thought, should we go back? And I have to say, we all collectively, all 7 of us, 3 people from Labour, Scott Snats, Lib Dems, myself and Jonathan from the Conservatives, we thought, well, our Queen was forged through not our founding myth, because Britain's been around quite a long time, but it was one of our recent founding, legends. The Queen learnt to drive a military truck during World War II. And I think genuinely she would have said, crack on, and so we came here because actually this is part of your founding myth. This is, the 4th time in 100 years you've tried for this. You've got to make it work now, because as the great historians we were talking to yesterday, an independent Ukraine is an incredibly important thing, not only for Eastern Europe, but for all of Europe. And eventually, critically, if it survives in whatever form, it is going to liberate the Russian Federation in due course. And that is a goal as well as Ukrainian independence. So Slava Ukraina. Thank you.
Not surprisingly, this conversation has provoked many hands in the air. So I'll turn to a few people. I just ask you to be as succinct as possible, because we've got only about 10 minutes, and there's more hands than minutes. And I know you in the front row, yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I wanted to react to what my dear friend Wolfgang said. Yes, there has to be reconciliation, but your reconciliation was based on the processing of what you had done by your people. And without that, it's not possible. The world already made that error after the Soviet Union collapsed. Sovietsky человек, Soviet people never had to process what they had done. And this is why we are in this situation. Russians are accusing the Baltic people for 30 years of being Russophobic. Our Western partners and allies similarly. And the reason is no one has processed that after the Second World War, the uneasy peace and Cold War was on the expense of many nations of Eastern Europe. This is an unprocessed territory. And without that, I think reconciliation cannot happen. And Germany did well there. I really hope Russia will do the same. Thank you.
Come on. We again, short comments, short reactions.
Yeah. Thank you. I would like also to build on what Wolfgang said, because indeed to achieve sustainable peace, we need to have Russia moving from an imperialistic autocratic regime to a peaceful democracy. And there are very few examples in the recent history where this happened. And the two obvious examples are Germany and Japan. And in both cases, it took capitulation and US occupation. So my question is, what will it take for Russia to transform from imperialistic autocratic regime to a peaceful democracy? Thank you.
Go ahead. But I'm glad we're thinking outside the box here.
I think the Second World War is not useful in this case. This is a colonial war. This is the last gasp of the Russian Empire. Think Vietnam, think Algeria, think Angola, think Ulster. And then I think you're closer to what the possible implications and solutions in Russia are.
Okay, I'm gonna be arbitrary. Yeah, 1 minute. Polls.
Yes.
Very quick.
So what Ukrainians think about the victory? This is a result of the polls which was conducted by the Democratic Initiatives Foundation in August. And 92% of Ukrainians believe in victory. 55% believe the victory is territorial integrity of Ukraine, and 21% more goes further, and we heard it during discussions. They consider a victory is destruction of the Russian army and stimulating uprising or dissolution or split inside Russia. I'm not sure how it's realistic, but that's what Ukrainians think. Thanks a lot.
Just as an aside, it's interesting, the American Secretary of Defense at one point articulated that one of our goals was to weaken Russia, and he got widely ridiculed. But so far, it might be one of the few goals that we've accomplished in the war. Sir.
If an agreement with the successor regime is ready for signing, subject to the deal breaker of Putin being surrendered to a court wanting him for trial, should the international community stick with its sanctions until and unless he is handed over, or should he be allowed, like the Kaiser, despite the Versailles Treaty, to go and retire on a farm, but probably not in the Netherlands?
It gets to the question of accountability and responsibility for war crimes, and whether for the act of aggression or for war crimes committed pursuant to that.
Я переконаний, що одного Путіна недостатньо на лаву.
I am sure that Putin is not the only person who should be on the bench of accused, because this was the collective Putin who started the war, unleashed the war against Ukraine. They allow him to do this. I followed the sociological surveys, and 82% of Russians considered that the idea of occupation of Poland is a good idea, and 42% of the Russians think that the occupation of Baltic states is a good idea. So they all should feel the sanctions. And by today, almost 60% of Russian ballistic missiles were used to hit Ukraine. And according to their logic, they should leave some strategic number, something like 25% of their ballistic missiles, if they are attacked. So now they have something like 18% of their ballistic missiles to continue to hit Ukraine. In order to restore, to replenish their storages, they need 5 years. And for this, they need chips, electronics, and other components that they get from the civilized world. So the sanctions should continue, should go on, in order for Russia not to rebuild itself, because if they rebuild themselves, they will again come with the world.
I think the treaty stipulates that the Kaiser is put on trial, and it was one of the first provisions of Versailles that was broken.
I don't know the answer to that. Mr. Minister, one of the things that came up at the last session was the possibility that a desperate Mr. Putin, whose forces were being pushed out of your country, might be more inclined to do even more desperate things, provoke an accident at a nuclear plant, possibly use chemical weapons, possibly use some sort of nuclear weapons in some fashion. Are you concerned about that?
Ну, ми завжди
Well, we have always to be alert. We've been warned at the Munich conference, something like 10 days before the full-scale invasion started, but we have learned not to be scared, and we ask the rest of you not to be scared as well. We know that they can be beaten, so let's not be scared, and that's it.
As regards tactical nukes, first of all, we would know in advance that he's moving the warheads from the storage facilities to the units. And secondly, I believe the United States has already warned Russia that the West has some options that he wouldn't like if he ever dared to use them.
No, yes, I believe that might be the case. Sir, we're going to give you the last question, and then we're going to wrap things up.
Thank you. I have a question for the Minister of Defense, which concerns both the idea of Russian, what we just evoked, the Russian ultimate options, and also the question of American support. Neil Ferguson is right here. Yesterday during a panel, basically ventured the proposition that the Americans were giving Ukraine enough weapons not to lose, but not enough weapons to win, probably because they're afraid of a catastrophic collapse of Russia forces on the ground and what that would entail. How is your feeling about this assessment that Neil made yesterday?
В мене інша оцінка. Я думаю, що я вже один раз про це сказав.
I have another assessment, because first, they have not delivered serious weaponry to us because there was an apprehension that we could surrender within 3 days and that this weaponry would be squandered. And now I know that when our partners in Washington, D.C. are deciding whether they give us new weaponry, they very carefully assess whether we can muster the use of these weapons within days, whether they have enough weapons to give to us, not diminishing their own defense capacity, whether their industry can quickly replenish their stores. And when the historic decision was adopted to give us 155mm cannons, first there were 777s, then Krabs, Panzerhauses, and at the moment we have 7 of 8 artillery systems, and they all are 155mm. Then another historic decision was about HIMARS and also about Millerets, and we were told that they will look for Grads and Smerches for us. And when they saw that they are not available, those Russian or Soviet-made systems, they arrived at a historical decision to give HIMARS to us. And when we demonstrated that we can efficiently use HIMARS and MLRS and German Mars and a lot of missiles that are used to successfully cut logistical chains in Kherson or Kharkiv oblasts, I think that this is the essence of arriving at political decisions. So I'm sure that there will be decisions concerning Patriots and other air protection systems, And the principal political decision on Patriots is already adopted, and we will have a decision on the combat tank and other kinds of weapons. When I was in Washington, D.C. in November as a newly appointed minister, and I was asking for just Stingers, I was told that this was impossible. And why, I asked, and they said the law does not allow us. And I told them, change the law. I can provide you with some Ukrainian advice how it is. What should we do? Dig trenches, they said. In January, we got first Stingers from our Lithuanian friends, of course, and this was allowed by the United States. I call this our delicacies.
Important, not always an easy, but an important conversation. And I think I want to thank the current minister, the former minister, for helping steering us through this. I also want to thank Victor for providing a forum where we could have these kinds of conversations. It's important. And two other things. I want to thank Svetlana and her entire team for all they've done. This was logistically an impressive feat. So well done. And I think it's great that we see how crowded this room is. It's a real tribute, I think, to people's commitment, to interest in these issues, commitment to Ukraine. So thank you all for your presence. And with that, I want to turn to the chairman to give us some parting insights.
Thank you, dear friends. Richard, to some extent, replaced my role to end this annual meeting of YES. But allow me, because of the situation, I will speak shortly to make some remarks. And I start to repeat what we heard today, that sometimes unbelievable can be truth. 1 year ago, when we discussed, we didn't expect a full-scale war. But when the war started, 24th of February, we didn't believe that Ukraine can be so strong, so determined, so well organized. I think this a feeling that blitzkrieg, this Russian aggression, very short and very effective, is quite realistic scenario. Today, when Richard Haass and our colleagues are speaking about 7, and I agree with Radek Sikorski, probably we have 8 scenarios, we are much closer to optimistic scenarios of Ukrainian victory, as this minimalistic or very pessimistic scenarios what we discussed at the beginning of the war. Success, the victory of Putin, and further aggressions, further actions against Moldova, maybe Baltic states, probably Poland as well, etc. So the situation changed very much, and even the mood of our conference is really quite promising, quite optimistic, what is very good. But still, the victory is in front of us. That is not done. And I would like to focus our common attention on 4 points, which, in my opinion, we can, as participants of this audience, we can contribute quite effectively. The first point is Ukraine needs serious, strong, and frankly speaking, unconditional support, militarily, financially, and humanitarian aid as well. We know that Ukrainian soldiers, officers, generals, they know how to use this weapon. This fears that we will send new weaponry and they will waste these things is absolutely not true. They know very well how to use it, and the effectiveness of this weapon in Ukrainian hands sometimes is higher as among NATO units, what is absolutely fantastic. And we should continue this support. Ukraine showed for us that in this difficult time can be well organized. The country, in state of the war, can work, can organize the visits, can play international role as well. And I think from our side it's necessary to underline unique, unbelievable, and extremely spectacular role of President Zelensky. I think without his engagement, his almost everyday speeches in all places of the world, to organize this support for Ukraine would be much more difficult. But frankly speaking, he's again in his profession. And he does all the things fantastic, and I think that's his next argument why we should continue this support for Ukraine. Point number 2, we should keep our unity. I think the unity of democratic world is a precondition of success. And we showed in this last 6 months that we can be united, what is not easy, we know something about it, but to keep unity in question of sanctions, in the question of Ukraine as a member of European Union, in all other elements is extremely important. Political unity and the unity of the citizens of our countries, that is something what we can offer to all of us, especially to Ukraine, and in what we can be helpful, because in this room we have politicians, ex-politicians, businessmen, intellectuals, journalists, professors, students, diplomats, etc. So that really the potential of this room is quite serious in all our countries where we are living, and I think we can use it to promote, to keep, and to strengthen the unity of democratic world in this support for Ukraine. Point number 3, this question of fatigue. In some countries, the people speak about war fatigue. In some countries, they speak more openly about Ukrainian fatigue. But any kind of fatigue is our enemy. Because, and time, and Zelensky told us in his speech yesterday, coming 90 days can be decisive. Because we will have a winter, we have inflation in our countries, the prices of energy are extremely high, the standards of life in some countries is visible lower, and this fatigue plus Russian disinformation, Russian hybrid propaganda war against our societies can be also extremely dangerous factor, dangerous momentum in coming months. So our task, our job should be also to fight against this feeling of fatigue, to fight against disinformation, to be active in media, to be active on various fields, to say that that is really a confrontation which we have to win. And without sufferers, without our engagement, that is impossible. And point number 4, what is very close to my heart, because it's speaking about finances, we speak about these finances which are coming to Ukraine, what is very good, especially to keep financial liquidity of Ukraine. This is something around $5 billion or euros today. That is the same for budget. Sometimes we speak about great plans like so-called Marshall Plan. In my opinion, we should find the better name for this plan, maybe the plan Ukraine 2.0, the plan of modern Ukraine, something like that. But that is still the future, because we need some elements of peace or some elements of stability to start such plan. But what we can do now, and what is, in my opinion, extremely important, is to organize not so big money, finances, to support all places in Ukraine which are relatively safe, to rebuild schools, kindergartens, hospitals, bridges, roads, etc. And that is possible to organize this money, because for these projects, smaller projects, in this safer part of Ukraine, we can find this private-public cooperation. We can find some investors. We can find the people who will be ready to support us. And why is so important? Because if we will create such safer and well-organized, well-equipped places in Ukraine, we have a chance for return of so many Ukrainians living today abroad. This drama probably was not enough mentioned during our conference, but look, 12 million people in Ukraine are displaced. 6 million people cross the borders. 2 million, especially women with children, are in Poland, and we are open for them. I think in this case we will not have, let's say, fatigue, what also is some risk of the situation. But if I tell you that 1st of September, the new school year, we open doors for 500,000 Ukrainian children, that shows what scale of this problem, and not for us, not for host countries. That is a main problem of Ukraine, because you need these people, you need this women and young generation, because if not, we will be close to some demographic catastrophe, what can be one of very negative consequences of that. So I would like to encourage you to be active together in these four elements, in these four politics. Of course, we don't create this great politics on the highest levels, but we can do our job as effectively as possible, and that is what I think could be good, our good contribution and good preparation for next Yalta meeting next year. And okay, I tell you, the optimism today is such, when I heard Ferguson speaking about ruins of Moscow, when I speak about possibility, Reznikov who spoke about why Moscow not, I tell you, in such good mood about our military presence in Moscow, in Poland, we had in 17th century, so quite long time ago. Well,
President Yushchenko always sent me SMS and asked, don't forget about the Taganrog.
Taganrog, well. So, dear friends, and now is a part when, on behalf of our board, I want to thank everybody who helped us to organize this conference, what Richard Haass mentioned correctly, very special conference, in very special conditions and circumstances. I think we will remember this long way by train to Kyiv and back as a good reminder of our students' time or something like that. But everything logistically was excellent prepared, and I think we should applaud the people who gave us such chance to organize this meeting. First, President Zelensky and his office. First Lady and her office. The government, Prime Minister, Minister of Defense, Minister of Foreign Affairs, all ministers, and everybody who helped us to organize this conference. I want to send our thanks to Victor Pinchuk, the founder of Yes, and what I want to add, without his imagination, what we know very well, without his determination, and without his optimism, it wouldn't be possible. And please understand that we discussed the idea of this conference 1 year ago, before 24th of February, and after that. And after that, to keep this track, was necessary to be extremely optimistic. So, Victor, thanks for your, because imagination we know very well, your imagination, your determination as well, but such optimism, that is something new what I've seen in your activities. I want to thank Thomas Weyer, where is Thomas, for his absolutely unbelievable contribution. Applause. I thank Björn Geldhoff, because this artistic view of this clothes, that is his great job. I want to thank Natalia Vovk, Svitlana Gritsenko, and Ludmila Griorenko. And now, please, a special applause to our guardian angel, Chief of YES team, Svitlana Kowalczuk. I want to thank members of YES board. This year they were extremely active. They were moderating, they were speaking, they were panelists. So applause to my friends from Yalta European Strategy Board. A special applause for all speakers and all guests, all participants of our conference. Go. And a special thanks for his patience and activity to President of Latvia, Egils Levits, who joined the conference for whole 2 days. Special thanks to translators. We don't see them, but they are working hardly from the beginning of the conference. We thank coordinators, interns, volunteers, YES partners, International Renaissance Foundation, and media partner, Foreign Affairs. So thank you, all of you, for your work. Dear friends, we exchanged this opinion during some breaks, etc., especially we veterans of YES conferences. It was for sure one of the best conferences of YES, and probably in this wartime it was really the best conference of YES. That is the next success of Mr. Putin, because after enlargement of NATO, membership of Sweden and Finland, I think success of such NGO organization like ours, this is a next, maybe not very expected, but success of this dangerous guy. So again, thank you for all of you. It was really fantastic, fascinating time which we spent together, and Slava Ukraini!